The dust from Douglas's Lexus hung in the air for nearly 3 minutes after they left. Eleanor stood at the edge of the property with her brown leather suitcase at her feet, watching the plumes settle slowly over the gravel road. The suitcase, the same one she had carried on her honeymoon 53 years ago, contained everything she owned now. 2 changes of clothes, her reading glasses, Harold's wedding band on a thin chain, and a manila envelope with the deed to 2 acres of condemned land. The barn loomed behind her like a tombstone. It was massive, skeletal, its red paint faded to a rust-colored ghost of what it must have been decades ago. The roof sagged in the middle where water had pooled for years. Weathered boards hung loose like ribs. And the entire structure seemed to be held together by obligation rather than structural integrity. A faded sign nailed to the door read, "Condemned, unsafe to enter," in black letters so old they had begun to fade back into the wood. Eleanor turned slowly to look at it, really look at it, as if seeing it for the first time. Perhaps she was. This morning, when Douglas and Patricia had arrived at the lawyer's office to settle Harold's estate, Eleanor hadn't asked many questions. She had been too shocked, too numb from 6 months of grief, to fully comprehend what was happening. But now, standing here in the late afternoon sun with her suitcase and 2 acres of nothing, the reality began to crystallize with painful clarity. Harold had been dead for 184 days. She had counted them. Some days she counted in hours. In the morning she found him slumped in his study chair, his reading glasses fallen to the carpet. His heart simply had stopped. No warning, no goodbye. Just the sudden, catastrophic silence of a man who had been at her side since she was 21 years old. She had buried him on a Tuesday in the cemetery overlooking the valley where they had spent their retirement years. 300 people came, former students she had taught through the library, colleagues, friends accumulated through 4 decades of quiet service. Douglas arrived in an imported suit that cost more than Eleanor's monthly pension. Patricia wore a black dress that probably had a designer name Eleanor wouldn't recognize. The reading of Harold's will was scheduled for the day after the funeral, but Eleanor asked if they could wait a week. She needed time to simply exist in the silence. Douglas had frowned but agreed, though she could see him calculating something behind his eyes. The kind of calculation that happened in spreadsheets and belonged in offices, not in the aftermath of death. When they gathered at the lawyer's office, Eleanor arrived in a simple cream blouse and gray skirt, her silver-white hair in the same loose bun she had worn for 30 years. Harold had loved that bun. He would kiss the back of her neck when she wore her hair that way, just above the collar. She wore it now as a way of keeping him close. The lawyer, a thin man named Mr. Pemberton, adjusted his glasses and began to read from the documents in a monotone that seemed obscene given the magnitude of what he was revealing. The house went to Douglas. The investment accounts went to Douglas. The retirement savings, all $860,000 accumulated over 4 decades of careful stewardship, went to Douglas. Eleanor listened with the kind of numbness that only comes after deep shock has become chronic. But then Mr. Pemberton paused. He shuffled through his papers, frowned, and withdrew a separate document that looked older than the others, its edges worn and slightly yellowed. "There is," he said slowly, "a property deed in Mr. Harold's name that was never consolidated into the estate planning. It's fairly remote, about 15 miles outside of town. According to the records, it's been in his possession for 23 years, though there's no mortgage or loan activity associated with it. The county assessment," he paused, clicking his tongue softly, "lists it as condemned, non-habitable. The structure has been deemed unsafe, worth essentially nothing." Eleanor felt rather than saw Douglas lean forward, The calculation in his eyes became hungry. "That would come to me," Douglas said flatly, "as the primary heir." "Not necessarily," Mr. Pemberton said, pushing his glasses up his nose. "Harold's notation on this deed is explicit. He leaves the property to his wife, Eleanor, with the following condition." He paused to read directly from the paper. "I leave this land and whatever it contains to my wife, Eleanor, in recognition of a debt I can never repay, and in hope that she will find in it what I have hidden for her." The room went absolutely still. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. Hidden. Harold had hidden something. For her. On land she had never known he owned. Douglas's expression shifted like a door slamming. "That's impossible. We discussed the estate with Dad months before he died. There was no mention of any separate property." "Nevertheless," Mr. Pemberton said, tapping the deed with his pen, "the documentation is clear and legally binding. The property is Mrs. Eleanor Marsh's." Patricia leaned close to Douglas, whispering something Eleanor couldn't hear, but the anger radiating from both of them became almost visible, like heat shimmer off summer asphalt. After a moment, Douglas turned back to the lawyer with a tight smile. "The property's worthless," he said carefully. "According to you, it's condemned. She can't live there. She can't sell it. She can't do anything with it." He looked at Eleanor directly for the first time since entering the office. "Look, Mom, I'm being practical here. You need somewhere to live. Patricia and I have discussed it. You can have the apartment above the garage at our place in the city. It's a good space, climate-controlled, safe, better than spending your final years out on some condemned property that should probably just be demolished." Eleanor had listened to the kindness in his voice, because it did sound kind, almost caring, and she had heard the trap beneath it. He wanted to keep her dependent. He wanted to keep her in the apartment above the garage, in the climate-controlled space where she would be safe, which was another way of saying invisible. She would not inherit the house. She would not have a home of her own. She would have a room that was not quite a room, in a space that was not quite a home. And she would spend her remaining years knowing that everything she and Harold had built had gone to Douglas and Patricia. Eleanor had picked up her suitcase and stood. "I'll take the condemned barn," she said quietly. Douglas's face flushed red. "That's foolish. That property is literally unsafe." "Then I'll be unsafe," Eleanor said. "On my own land, which is my choice to make." She had walked out of the lawyer's office with the deed in hand, her suitcase rolling behind her on its small wheels, and did not look back. Douglas had not called her in the 3 days since. Neither had Patricia. This morning, Douglas had simply sent a text message saying he would help her move her few personal possessions to the property. And had shown up at her friend Catherine's house, where she had been staying temporarily, with Patricia, and absolutely no help. They had stood at the gate of the condemned barn while Eleanor retrieved her suitcase and the papers Mr. Pemberton had given her. And then they had left without saying a word. Now Eleanor picked up the suitcase and approached the barn. The September sun was beginning its descent, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. The condemned barn, in this light, was almost beautiful. It stood against the sky like a monument to something lost. She could see the mountains in the distance, and the property was surrounded by trees on 3 sides, wild and overgrown, but trees nonetheless. It was isolated, certainly, but it was hers. She had expected to feel afraid, alone, devastated by the magnitude of her circumstances. But standing here, a 74-year-old woman with nothing but a suitcase and a condemned barn, Eleanor felt something unexpected stir in her chest. It wasn't hope exactly. It was something quieter than hope. It was curiosity. Harold had hidden something for her. That fact had taken root in her mind and was beginning to grow. spreading through her shock like a tendril of ivy. What could he have possibly hidden on a condemned property he'd never mentioned? Why would he own land for 23 years without telling her? The door to the barn was locked, but the padlock was rusted and crumbling with age. Eleanor used a piece of kindling to pry at it, and it fell apart in her hands like dust. The door itself was weathered but sturdy, and when she pulled, it swung inward with a groan of protesting hinges that had not been oiled in years. The smell hit her first, the deep, rich smell of hay and old wood, dust and decay, and underneath it something else, something that smelled like purpose, like care. Inside the barn, the light came through gaps in the boards in long, dusty shafts. The floor was covered in hay at least 2 feet deep in most places, scattered and disorganized, as if it had been left undisturbed for decades. The walls, what she could see of them beneath the deterioration and neglect, were indeed as condemned as they appeared. There were holes where animals could have nested. The roof leaked in several places. She could see water stains and rot spreading across the wooden beams above like disease. The barn was a study in abandonment. And yet, Eleanor stepped inside, and her boots sank into hay up to her ankle. She looked around slowly, her eyes adjusting to the dimness, and something in her mind began to shift. There was something wrong with the decay here. Not wrong exactly. False. The rot on the floor near the far wall looked weathered, but the debris around it seemed deliberately positioned. The hay was haphazardly scattered as if to hide something. The water stains were old, but they were arranged almost intentionally across certain areas, while others, despite having holes above them, remained relatively dry. Eleanor began to move deeper into the barn, using her hands to clear away hay as she went. Her expensive suitcase sat by the door like a reproach, a symbol of her old life, the wife of a respectable man, the former school librarian in her cream blouse. She ignored it and kept moving. Near the back wall, she found something that made her stop. Fresh lumber, not weathered and aged like the rest of the barn. New, relatively speaking. The wood was beneath the hay, carefully hidden, but when she pulled the hay away, she could see planks of treated pine arranged in a pattern. They formed a rectangle, and in that rectangle, sunk into the concrete floor that seemed incongruous with the barn's rustic appearance, was a door. Not a barn door, a proper door. Heavy metal, industrial, set into the floor. It had a handle and hinges and a keyhole. It looked like it belonged to a vault or a basement or somewhere underground. It looked like exactly the kind of door someone would install if they were hiding something intentionally, carefully, with full knowledge that someday, perhaps today, perhaps now, someone would come looking for it. Eleanor's hands trembled as she pulled the last of the hay away from the door. She tested the handle. It was locked, but a key hung on a hook, driven into the barn's interior post, positioned at just the right height, where she would find it if she looked. It had a tag attached to it. Eleanor reached for the tag and looked at the writing. One word, in her husband's familiar handwriting. Eleanor. She fit the key into the lock. It turned smoothly, well-maintained, well-used. The door swung upward on hydraulic hinges, revealing a set of stairs descending into darkness. There was a light switch just inside the opening. Eleanor felt for it, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break her ribs. The switch clicked. Lights illuminated along the stairs, leading down into the earth. Eleanor began to descend. The basement, and it was a basement, vast and impossibly well constructed, was lit by soft, warm lighting along the walls. As Eleanor's eyes adjusted, she began to see what Harold had built. It was part workshop, part living space, part sanctuary, The walls were insulated and finished with drywall. The ceiling was low but well constructed, supported by reinforced beams. There was electricity. Solar panels must be hidden outside, she realized, and the gentle hum of a space heater suggested climate control. A wood stove stood in one corner, its chimney running up through the ceiling to the barn above. There was a large work table in one section, surrounded by shelves containing Harold's woodworking supplies. Tools she had never seen him use, because she realized now he had been building them down here for years. Yet there was a small living area with a cot and a desk. There was actual plumbing, a sink, a small toilet discreetly partitioned off. A well. Harold must have dug a well. Everything was immaculately maintained, organized, and lovingly constructed. Some sections showed years of work. Other sections looked like they had been recently updated. On the desk, Eleanor found an envelope with her name written on it. Inside were letters. She recognized the handwriting immediately. Harold's careful, precise script. The way he formed his capital A's with that little flourish. She opened the first letter, and her knees went weak, so suddenly she had to sit down on the cot, the only place available. "My dearest Eleanor," the letter began. "By now I am gone. I know this because I would never have wanted you to come here while I was still alive. Only you. Because you are the only one who ever truly saw me, only in desperation, because I could not protect you any other way." Eleanor's vision blurred with tears. She forced herself to keep reading. "I bought this property in 1977 under my own name when Douglas was still in college. I had just been promoted to chief financial officer of the firm. Do you remember? I came home that evening and told you over dinner, and you smiled that smile you always had, like you were proud of me, not for the job, but simply for existing. That night, lying in bed, I had a thought so clear and terrible that I couldn't sleep. What happens if something happens to me? What happens to you? We had built a life together, Eleanor. 40 years by then. You had sacrificed your career to raise the children, to support my ambitions, to make a home for us. And if I died, what was waiting for you was exactly what's happening now. Nothing." Eleanor pressed the letter to her chest, unable to read further for a moment. Outside, the last of the daylight was fading. Inside the barn, inside this impossible space Harold had created, the lights burned steadily, unchanging. She had the sense of stepping outside of time, into a place that had been waiting for her for 23 years. She continued reading, her tears now falling freely onto the old paper. "I built this space for you, not just as a shelter, but as proof. Proof that I loved you more than I ever loved the life we built on the surface. Every tool I placed here, every wire I ran, every board I sanded smooth, it was an act of love. It was me saying to you, I know you. I know what the world will do to you when I'm gone. I know that Douglas has always been greedy, and I know that Patricia feeds that greed. I know that you will be left with nothing if you allow them to make you comfortable, because comfort disguises abandonment perfectly." The letter went on. There were 4 of them, each describing a different phase of the property's construction. Harold detailed the year he dug the well, 1987. The year he installed the solar panels, 1995. The year he made his will and added the clause sending the property to Eleanor, 2002. He described how he had researched the county assessment records, how he had deliberately let the barn above fall into disrepair to discourage anyone from exploring the property, how he had worked on this space in secret, on weekends when she thought he was at the office, in the evenings when he told her he was taking a walk. In the final letter, Harold wrote, "I won't ask your forgiveness for deceiving you about this, But I will ask your understanding. I could not have survived watching you know what I was building, because I could not have survived telling you that I expected Douglas to betray you. Some truths are too terrible to carry into a marriage. So I carried them alone, and I built this place alone, and I left it for you alone. The deed and the key are the only truths I could leave behind. Eleanor stayed in that basement as night fell completely. She read every letter, touching the paper as if it might carry some warmth of Harold's hand. She opened the desk drawers and found more documents, financial records, updated within the last year, investments in her name, a bank account, established secretly, with $74,000 in it, accessed regularly by Harold, left untouched for the last 6 months since his death. He had left her money. Not much in the grand scheme of their life together, but enough. Enough to survive. Enough to start again. There were other documents too. The deed to the property, with detailed notes about the water rights, the soil quality, the potential for the land to be used for almost anything Eleanor could imagine. There was a folder labeled Contacts with names of contractors Harold trusted, all with notes about which services they provided. Another labeled Maintenance with detailed schedules for keeping the solar panels clean, the well functioning, the structures sound. He had thought of everything. At the very bottom of the desk drawer, wrapped carefully in cloth, Eleanor found a photograph. It was from their honeymoon, taken 53 years ago. She was 21 years old, standing in front of a mountain lake, and Harold had caught her mid-laugh, genuinely delighted about something now forgotten. On the back, in his handwriting, "This is who I built it for." Eleanor held the photograph and allowed herself to grieve in a way she hadn't been able to since his death. She grieved for the burden he had carried alone. She grieved for the love so deep it had made him plan for a future he would not see. She grieved for the fact that she had never known in all their years together that he was so afraid she would be alone. But when the tears finally ceased, something else was waiting underneath them. Not relief exactly, but its quieter cousin, understanding. Harold hadn't abandoned her after all. He had simply gone ahead, just like he had always done, and prepared the way. He had left her a message written in the language of construction and care. He had taken his fear and transformed it into shelter. Eleanor climbed back up the stairs to the barn. Above ground, the September night was clear and full of stars. She could see the Milky Way stretching across the sky like a river of light. She retrieved her suitcase from where she had left it and placed it inside the basement, at the foot of the cot, as a talisman. Then she climbed back up again and closed the door, leaving the barn sealed as it had been. She would come back tomorrow. Tomorrow she would begin the work of truly seeing what Harold had left her, of planning what came next, of deciding what a life could look like when built on the foundation of that kind of love. But tonight, for the first time since his death, Eleanor Marsh lay down to sleep with the understanding that she was not truly alone. She was never going to be truly alone, because Harold had made sure of it, one careful board and one thoughtful decision at a time. The barn stood against the night sky like a guardian, holding its secrets. The next morning came gray and cool, with the smell of autumn approaching in the air. Eleanor woke in the basement with no memory of falling asleep, her body simply having decided it was time to rest, and having done so absolutely. She found the switch for the lights and began to explore more systematically what Harold had built. The workshop section was extraordinary. There were hand tools organized with the precision of a museum exhibit, chisels and planes and saws, all meticulously maintained. There were wood stains and varnishes, carefully labeled in Harold's handwriting, with the date of purchase and specific properties. On the workbench, Eleanor found a half-finished jewelry box, its marquetry pattern incomplete, the wood beside it waiting for the final pieces. She recognized the pattern. It was meant to be a scene of the lake house where they had spent their 10th anniversary. Harold had been making her a jewelry box. Year after year in this hidden space, he had been building it. Eleanor found the tool he had been using and examined the pattern. It required tremendous precision, and Harold's vision for it was ambitious. Too ambitious, she thought at first. But looking at the pattern more closely, she realized that what had looked incomplete to her was simply waiting for her hands. It was as if he had known somehow, that she would come here, and he had left her work to do. Work that would keep her mind engaged and her hands occupied, and would force her to complete the beautiful thing he had started. She found a small box of Eleanor's jewelry beside the workbench. The piece she wore every day, her wedding ring, her late mother's brooch. Harold had kept samples of wood stains near them, as if he had been studying how to match the jewelry box to the colors of her life. By midday, Eleanor had mapped out the entire basement. It was roughly the size of the barn above, perhaps 800 square feet. The living area was simple but functional. The woodworking area was a workshop any carpenter would envy. There was a section she hadn't fully explored, with a door leading to what appeared to be storage. Inside were supplies, canned food, some of it expired, though most of it was recent. Blankets. Clothing in her size, she realized, looking at the labels. Harold had bought her clothing for a future he couldn't predict. She found herself crying again, but different tears this time. Not grief exactly, but something closer to gratitude. The afternoon was spent surveying the property outside the barn. Eleanor ventured into the overgrown field surrounding the structure. The wild grass came up to her waist, and she moved through it slowly, her brown ankle boots soaked with dew and crushed vegetation. There were flowers here too, wildflowers, goldenrod and asters and things she couldn't name. They grew in chaotic beauty, and Eleanor realized that what had looked like neglect from the road was actually a beautiful kind of restoration. The land was returning to itself, healing whatever damage had been done to it before Harold bought it. Near the tree line, she found a small structure that had been almost entirely reclaimed by moss and vines. When she pulled back the vegetation, she could see solar panels mounted on its roof, their surfaces green with algae. This must be the power station. She made a mental note to clean it, to restore it. Harold had installed it and maintained it, and now it would be her responsibility. The property, she realized, was not hopeless. It was simply asleep. It was waiting for someone to see its potential. It was waiting for her. That night, Eleanor sat in the basement with the letters spread before her, and she opened the folder labeled Contacts. There were numbers written in Harold's careful hand. Tom Castellano, Electrical Systems. Martha Wu, Plumbing and Water. Robert Hayes, Construction and Carpentry. Beside each name, Harold had written notes. Tom fixed the solar array in 2009 and again in 14. Reliable, keeps quiet. Martha understands the well system. She's good people. Robert is the only contractor I trust to understand what this is. Eleanor picked up the phone and dialed the first number. Tom Castellano, a voice answered, male, weathered with age. Hello, Eleanor said, her voice small in the darkness of the basement. This is Eleanor Marsh. My husband, Harold Marsh, asked me to contact you. There was a pause. Harold, the voice said carefully. He passed away recently. I'm so sorry to hear that. What can I help you with? I need the property restored, Eleanor said, finding her strength as the words came. The solar array, the electrical system, all of it. I need to make this place livable, above ground. Another pause, longer this time. "I can be there tomorrow morning," Tom said. Eleanor spent the next few weeks in transformation. Tom came and spent an entire day cleaning the solar panels, testing the array, running diagnostics on the system Harold had installed. He declared it fundamentally sound, just neglected. He upgraded a few components, brought in a generator for backup, installed new batteries. "Your husband knew what he was doing," Tom said as he worked, glancing at Eleanor occasionally, as if trying to reconcile the elderly woman supervising his work with the secret Harold had been keeping. He never asked questions, and Eleanor appreciated that. Harold had chosen his contractors well. Martha Wu came and examined the well, the water lines, the plumbing system. She found several areas that needed attention, made the repairs efficiently and quickly, and showed Eleanor how to maintain everything. She also asked no questions, though her eyes softened when Eleanor mentioned they had been married for 53 years. Robert Hayes came and examined the barn's structural integrity. He was a large man with kind eyes and a methodical way of working. After he spent the first day examining the building, he brought in a detailed report and a proposal. "The barn's not salvageable as a barn," he said, spreading blueprints on the workbench in the basement. "But the structure has good bones. I can stabilize it, reinforce it, and we can open it up, install large windows, create skylights, bring light and air into it. We could make this space beautiful. We could make it livable." Eleanor leaned over the blueprints. In Robert's vision, the condemned barn became a soaring open living space. The roof would be partially cleared, massive windows would replace the boarded sections. The interior would be transformed into a studio-like environment with the basement below serving as a bedroom and workshop. It would be extraordinary. "How much?" Eleanor asked. "Your husband prepaid for significant work," Robert said carefully. "Back in 2015, he gave me a deposit, said he wanted the barn shell restored whenever that time came. He was very specific about it. I kept the deposit in escrow, waiting. The remaining cost would be about $12,000. Eleanor had $74,000 in her secret account. $12,000 was manageable. "Do it," she said. Robert worked for 6 weeks. Eleanor watched the transformation with wonder and something approaching happiness. The condemned barn became a workshop and studio space. Massive windows were installed along the south-facing wall. The roof was reinforced and partially replaced, with skylights installed so that the space filled with natural light. The interior walls were insulated and finished with pale plaster. The floor was sealed concrete, polished to a soft sheen. By the time Robert finished, the condemned barn had become something Eleanor would have called beautiful, a soaring space filled with light and possibility. The basement remained the bedroom, the private space, the heart of the sanctuary. But now the two spaces worked together. The barn above was for living, for projects, for the future. The basement was for remembrance, for rest, for the deep foundation Harold had built. By early November, Eleanor had begun to establish a rhythm. She woke in the basement, sometimes with one of Harold's letters on her pillow, reminders she had left for herself to find. She made coffee in the small kitchen area. She climbed the stairs to the barn and opened the skylights, watching the light flood in. She worked on the jewelry box, slowly completing the intricate marquetry pattern Harold had started. Her hands, which had been arthritic with age just weeks before, seemed to gain strength and precision through the work. In the afternoons, she would work on the property itself. She cut back the wild grasses into more manageable patterns. She planted a garden, vegetables and herbs, in a cleared section near the barn. She discovered that the property had a small stream running through it, hidden by overgrown vegetation. She cleared the path to it and sat beside it sometimes, watching the water move over stones. One morning in mid-November, as Eleanor was clearing dead branches from the tree line, she heard a vehicle approaching. Her heart clenched. She wasn't expecting anyone. Robert had finished his work. The contractors had been paid. Was it Douglas? Had he finally come, perhaps with lawyers, to contest the deed? But the vehicle that pulled up was an old pickup truck, painted a faded blue, with a woman of about 68 at the wheel. She had silver hair, and she was wearing denim overalls over a flannel shirt. "Hello there," the woman called out as she emerged from the truck. "My name is June Whitaker. I own the property next to this one. And I've been watching the progress you've made here with considerable interest." Eleanor, covered in dust and bits of branch, felt a flutter of wariness. "Is there a problem?" "Not at all," June said, approaching with an easy smile. "I just wanted to introduce myself. I saw the condemned barn was being fixed up, and I wanted to make sure whoever moved in was the type of neighbor who'd be good to have out here. The previous owner was a mystery man. Came by maybe once a year, never did much with the place. But I could tell someone cared about it, the way the lawn was occasionally maintained." Eleanor felt something in her chest loosen. This woman was not a threat. "I'm Eleanor Marsh," she said. "I inherited the property from my late husband." "June Whitaker," the woman repeated, extending a hand. Her grip was warm and firm. I live about a quarter mile that way." She gestured toward the woods. "I've got a small farm, nothing too serious, mostly for my own use now that I'm retired. But I'm a decent neighbor if you need one." Eleanor invited June inside. She showed her the barn, nervous about what this stranger would think of her project. But June's face lit up with genuine appreciation. "This is remarkable," June said, running her hand along the polished concrete floor. "What was this before?" "A condemned building," Eleanor said. "My husband left it to me, and I've been restoring it." June looked at her with sharp, intelligent eyes. "Your husband sounds like a wise man." Eleanor did not show June the basement. That was too private, too sacred. But she did accept when June invited her to visit the farm, to meet her goats and chickens, and to see the small greenhouse where June grew heirloom tomatoes. By the time December arrived, Eleanor and June had fallen into an easy companionship. June would visit the barn in the afternoons with fresh eggs or vegetables from her stores. Eleanor would offer homemade bread or tea. They would sit in the barn, under the skylight, and talk about books and gardening, and the way the light changed through the seasons. It was June who asked finally about the family. "You don't have visitors," June said gently, one afternoon over tea. "I haven't seen any family come out. It's none of my business, but you look like the kind of woman who would have children." Eleanor set down her cup. "I have one son," she said carefully. "He has his own life. He's very busy." "That's a shame," June said. "Though I suppose some people are too busy to appreciate what their parents left for them." Eleanor didn't respond, but she felt gratitude for June's assumption. This woman had somehow understood, without being told, that Eleanor's circumstances were not simple. By early January, 6 months after Eleanor had found the door under the barn's hay, the jewelry box was complete. She had finished Harold's marquetry, sanding and staining the final pieces until they matched the rest of the pattern perfectly. Inside, she had lined it with velvet she purchased in town, in the same burgundy Harold had written about in his notes. She placed the photograph from their honeymoon inside, and the photograph alone. The night she finished it, Eleanor sat in the basement holding the box, and she allowed herself to open the folder labeled Financial Documents more thoroughly. Harold had been more clever than she had initially understood. The investments were real, managed by a firm that had sent her quarterly statements all these months. Statements she hadn't fully absorbed in her grief. The bank account with $74,000 was earning interest. There were other accounts, others' funds, money that Harold had systematically set aside over decades, always out of Douglas's sight, always protected. Eleanor did the math carefully with pen and paper on the basement desk. When she was finished, she sat back in shock. She was not wealthy exactly, but she was not poor either. She had enough money to live quietly and comfortably for the rest of her life if she was careful. She had enough money to maintain the property, to eventually expand it if she wanted. She had enough money to be independent of Douglas forever. Harold had not just hidden money. He had hidden independence. He had hidden the future. 3 months later, in April, Eleanor received a letter. The return address was Marsh & Associates Financial Law. Inside was a formal notification that Douglas and Patricia had challenged the will, claiming undue influence. The letter requested that Eleanor appear at a mediation session in 2 weeks to discuss the property in question. Eleanor read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in her pocket. She walked upstairs to the barn, where she had begun working on a new project, a series of shelves to display her completed jewelry box and the other items Harold had left for her. In the light from the skylights, surrounded by the space Harold had envisioned for her, Eleanor felt something settle into her chest. It was not anger, it was clarity. She dressed carefully for the mediation. She wore her faded blue cardigan over a cream blouse, her gray wool skirt, her worn brown ankle boots. She carried her brown leather suitcase with brass clasps, the one she had carried to the condemned barn 6 months ago. She set it on the table in front of Douglas, Patricia, their lawyer, her own lawyer, and the mediator. "I want you to see this," she said to Douglas. "I want you to understand what your father left me." Douglas's face darkened. "Mom, this is not the appropriate place. Your father bought property in 1977. Eleanor continued, her voice soft but clear. "He kept it in his name and never told me. He built a space underneath a condemned barn, a workspace, and a home over the course of 23 years. He paid contractors to maintain it in secret. He left me legal documents, financial records, and letters explaining why he did this." She opened the suitcase. Inside was everything: the letters, the photographs, the deed, the financial documents, Harold's notes about his intentions. "He did this," Eleanor said, "because he knew what you were. He knew you would take everything from me if you could. He knew you would offer me an apartment above your garage and call it kindness. He knew you would make me dependent. And he spent 23 years ensuring that would never happen." Douglas stood up. "This is ridiculous. Those documents could be forged. Your handwriting expertise could be purchased. We don't have to listen to—" "Your father also," Eleanor interrupted, still calm, "did not trust you with financial details, so he hired a law firm specifically to manage his separate account. He assigned them to contact you if you contested his will. They would be very interested in explaining the chain of custody for the documents, the dates of the transactions, the maintenance records." She looked at the lawyer, who nodded slightly. Eleanor's lawyer had already brought them on board. "The property," Eleanor said, "is mine. The accounts are mine. The money is mine. And your father left a final letter, which you should hear." She withdrew the last envelope, sealed, marked for Douglas. "He asked that I give this to you only in the circumstance that you tried to contest the will," Eleanor said. She set it on the table. Douglas's face had gone pale. He didn't touch the letter. "You can open it," Eleanor said gently. "Or not. But either way, this mediation is over. I have a deed. I have a home. I have everything I need. And your father made absolutely certain you could never take it from me." The mediator looked at the documents. The lawyers conferred quietly, and within an hour it was concluded. Douglas and Patricia had no case. The property belonged to Eleanor. The accounts belonged to Eleanor. Everything Harold had left was legitimately and legally Eleanor's, and there was nothing that could be done about it. As Eleanor was leaving, she saw Douglas finally open the letter. She watched his face as he read Harold's words, and she saw him wince as if he had been struck. She did not ask him what it said. Some truths, as Harold had written, were too terrible to carry. Let Douglas carry his own. By summer, Eleanor had made the barn into something extraordinary. She had expanded the skylight system. She had installed proper flooring on a raised platform in the center of the space, creating a clear area for her woodworking projects. She had built shelving along the walls to display Harold's tools, the jewelry box, the finished pieces she was beginning to create herself. She had even installed a stove, converting one corner into a small kitchen area above ground, where she could cook meals while watching the property through the windows. June had helped with much of this. Together they had planted a large vegetable garden outside. Together they had cleared more of the wild undergrowth and discovered that beneath it was a previous owner's attempt at a fruit orchard. Some of the trees were still alive, years away from productive, but alive. They had pruned them carefully and planned for the future. In 5 years, Eleanor would have apples. In 5 years, she would have a home full of abundance. On a warm afternoon in July, exactly 1 year after Eleanor had first found the door under the hay, June arrived with a bottle of wine. They sat on the wide wooden bench Eleanor had installed near the barn's main window, looking out over the property as the summer sun began its descent toward the mountains. "I have to ask," June said carefully, "what was in that letter? The one you gave to your son?" Eleanor smiled. It was a small smile, but it was genuine. "Harold wrote about his expectations for Douglas," Eleanor said. "He wrote about his disappointment. He wrote about the fact that he had set aside money for Douglas to inherit after Eleanor died, and that as long as Eleanor lived, Douglas would receive nothing. He wrote that Douglas's greed had forfeited his inheritance." And then, Eleanor paused, remembering. And then, at the very end, Harold wrote that he hoped Douglas would learn that love was not transaction, that family was not investment, that his mother was not an asset to be liquidated. He hoped Douglas would come to understand what he had lost, not in money, but in respect, in dignity, in the simple human connection between a father and son. "And will he?" June asked quietly. "Understand?" Eleanor poured the wine, watching the liquid catch the golden hour light. "I don't know," she said. "But that was Harold's hope, and I honor that by living well, by making something beautiful from what was abandoned, by proving that the elderly, when given the chance, can be more than anyone expects." June raised her glass. "To Harold," she said, "and to you. To second chances," Eleanor said instead. "To the possibility of love outlasting even death. To the fact that sometimes the greatest inheritance is not money, but the knowledge that someone believed in you enough to spend 23 years preparing a future you could inherit." The sun set slowly over the barn, turning the sky the color of honey and fire. The windows of the restored structure glowed with warm light. Inside the barn, tools hung from their designated places. Harold's jewelry box sat on the main shelf, and the brown leather suitcase with brass clasps sat by the door, a monument to the woman who had arrived with nothing and found that nothing had been the greatest gift of all. In the basement below, the cot held fresh linens. Harold's letters were preserved in archival boxes. The accounts and documents were organized and accessible. The hidden space was hidden no longer, but it remained sacred, a space filled with the proof of love, the certainty of planning, the absolute assurance that someone had believed enough in Eleanor's worthiness to spend decades ensuring she would never be alone. Eleanor had arrived at the condemned barn as a 74-year-old woman with a suitcase and nothing else. 6 months later, she had a home, A year later, she had a life filled with possibility, purpose, and the quiet knowledge that the betrayal she had suffered had been transformed into vindication through the patient love of a man who had seen her true value long before she saw it herself. The barn stood against the summer sky, no longer condemned. It stood as testament to what can grow when love is given room to take root. It stood as proof that dreams don't age, that the elderly are not disposable, that the greatest inheritances are not measured in money, but in the knowledge that we have been truly seen, truly known, and truly loved by another human being. And Eleanor, in her faded cardigan and worn boots, with silver white hair in a loose bun and warm hazel eyes that finally held peace, had learned what Harold knew all along, that the condemned barn was never meant to be a shelter. It was meant to be a home,